Many of us believe that the development of a vibrant green economy is vital to Britain's economic as well as environmental future. But how should we best foster the green economy, and is there a role for government intervention? Should the state try to actively stimulate green innovation and development? Or should the bumbling bureaucrats simply get out of the way and leave it to the dynamic venture capitalists and entrepreneurs? My name is Julian Morgan and I'm the Chief Economist at Green Alliance. The role of the state in innovation and industrial development was the topic of the second in a series of 6 Green Alliance economic seminars. For this seminar I was delighted to be joined by Mariana Mazzucato, R.M. Phillips Professor of Science and Technology at the University of Sussex. Mariana is one of the leading lights in this field, particularly since the publication of her book, The Entrepreneurial State, and her advice on these questions is now sought by governments around the world. These seminars are intended to help build understanding of the economic orthodoxies that underpin green policy and the arguments used to support or challenge them. So I began by asking Mariana to spell out what economists mean by innovation and why it is so important to economics and economic growth. In response, she also emphasised that although innovation is one of the defining characteristics of capitalism, neoclassical economics has great difficulties in explaining it. Here's what she had to say on this.
It's a trick question in some ways because how it's often used is, I think, a bit too wide. I mean, the mafia was an innovation, right? It was an organizational innovation. It was useful to many people and not to others. There's been all sorts of innovation in the financial industry, which many are questioning today, whether it was helpful or not. So it's not just about change, at least when I talk about innovation and think of its importance in the growth process, both at the firm level, the industry level, at the national level. It's actually about change which fundamentally, at least on average over time, increases the quality sort of cost relationship of the particular product or service that we're looking at. And change is extremely, that's the main point, right? Because capitalism, what came before capitalism was, 500 years of feudalism? And there was lots of inertia. There wasn't change. So one of the defining characteristics, in fact, of capitalism, besides the market system, which is also a very, misunderstood area, and I would recommend everyone who wants to think about the history of markets specific to capitalism, read Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. But innovation, what's interesting when you consider it in terms of this issue around change, forget for now if it's good change or bad change, is just how much it really destroys so many assumptions behind economic theory. In terms of this notion of the representative agent, which we still have in many models, the linear models that we have in industrial organizations.
Just can I stop you there?
Yeah, sorry.
Representative agent.
Yeah. Right, so Schumpeter, who was one of the biggest sort of thinkers around innovation, the reason that he gave it a lot of importance is that he said, in neoclassical economics, he didn't call it that, but anyway, traditional mainstream economics, we assume that differences between firms, companies, can only be explained in terms of imperfect competition, right? Because we have this analysis of what perfect competition is. There's different criteria of which one is. You have sort of an infinite number of different companies which don't have power, any one of them on top of the other in terms of, say, pricing, at least over time. You have perfect information. So as soon as you introduce something like innovation, which of course we all know no one would bother doing unless you can actually appropriate the returns for some bit of time, no one can imitate you. We can only really talk about this in neoclassical economics if you introduce different characteristics under imperfect competition. For example, asymmetric information or, say, patents, which we all know are very common, we introduce in neoclassical theory only through an analysis of imperfect competition. So his point was like, hold on, this is a bit weird. One of the defining characteristics of capitalism is innovations, firms competing for market share through this differentiation process. And the only way we can actually talk about that when we teach micro and macro is through this notion of imperfect competition. He said that's wrong. We should actually have as a benchmark, right? Because it's not that everyone thinks that we have perfect competition, but the point is to talk about anything real around innovation. The benchmark that you're then distancing yourself from is this notion of perfect competition, which has no innovation. He said, what we really need is a proper theory of competition, which at its heart actually has innovation, because that is a defining characteristic of capitalism. And that, I must say that today, so many scholars, for example, in my community, where we think about innovation and its impact on firms, on industry structure, how it differs between industries, how it differs also between different types of innovations, competence destroying versus competence enhancing, that whole competitive aspect, which Schumpeter put at the center of his analysis. In other words, this is all about competition. How do we actually analyze, also as policymakers, how firms are competing? That dimension is very interesting, has almost been ignored. And it was actually the most radical point in Schumpeter. So we talk about him as being the big innovation thinker. He was actually the big competition thinker. Because if you think about it, competition policy today, in some ways, doesn't really capture the whole innovation thing, right? I mean, of course, this came out with the Microsoft case some years ago, where yes, they were very big, but as long as you are producing, in theory, products that are better than your competitors, and somehow that's good. But for me, at least, what's very interesting about innovation, and the reason I'm interested in it, is because I believe that is, in the end, the key way that firms try to differentiate themselves.
Would you subscribe to the notion that this is one of the key drivers of economic growth?
Yeah, I mean, but that's...
More in a macro sense, not just in the firm sense.
Yes, in terms of the long-run drivers of productivity and growth, it is. Of course, then there's a whole debate today, it's a very big debate today on the relationship with inequality, which maybe we'll get to later. But I think there's not that much debate, at least even between heterodox and pretty mainstream economists. This is one area that there's not much debate on, that it's actually innovation, which is one of the key drivers of long-run growth. Where then, and I'll just say quickly, sorry, these are my little parentheses, where then the big difference comes in is not only probably the things that you spoke about to Dimitri about last week, but other things like, are we talking about just risk, that innovation is risky, or is it really uncertain? And for example, that risk versus uncertain dimension about innovation within kind of mainstream endogenous growth theory, which again, maybe we'll talk about later, but it's kind of the way that innovation is introduced today in pretty traditional models. They still model, say, R&D, kind of like a lottery, whereas in the Schumpeterian, let's just call it framework, innovation comes in waves, it's clustered, it's persistent. You can't really model it like a Gaussian, bell curve, kind of normal distribution. It's not equally likely to happen at any moment in time. It's again, clustered. It's characterized by these fat tails, which means that the math behind these two different frameworks, the statistics behind it, the narratives behind it in terms of kind of long waves versus this kind of lottery metaphor are extremely different. Yeah. But the one area there's no debate on is whether innovation is important. Everyone agrees with that, but this, to say, the very fact everyone agrees with it kind of means that we're not talking about anything interesting.
Yeah.
It's the details that matter, how you talk about it.
I then asked Mariana if we can measure the pace of innovation, and how we might go about doing this. She outlined some of the alternatives and the limitations of approaches using patent data.
Well, it's interesting because there's all sorts of different data on innovation. I once did a study on automobiles, and I used different indicators of innovation, including a wonderful study, which not many industries have, but automobiles does, where some engineers at MIT actually had gone through every single thing which they thought was an innovation in automobiles and categorized it between 1 and 7, where 7 was really, really radical. Things like, the introduction of mass production and the assembly line in automobile production, the internal combustion engine, versus a 1, which is, very incremental innovation, like a new paint. And first of all, what was interesting there is there were no 6s and 7s after 1940. That already is quite interesting. But anyway, if you compared that data to, say, patent data and citation-weighted patent data, right? Because patents in and of themselves don't tell you much unless you weight them by the citations they receive by other patents. And then if you plotted it over time and looked at sort of waves of really radical versus incremental innovation, so the citation-weighted patents would be the really radical, say, innovations, whereas those patents that got no citations would be incremental. The two figures were very different. So if we use this nice engineering, detailed survey, actually, people who actually knew what they were talking about, paint versus internal combustion engine, the figure that was plotted out from that characterization over time series of innovations was different from the citation-weighted patents. The patent data has huge problems because things like legislation have completely changed. What can be patented? So if you just look at the patent numbers, it looks like, for example, since 1980, oh, huge amount of innovation. That's in fact why we think we're in a knowledge economy, information society, or whatever people call it. It's just because of things like the Bayh-Dole Act, which all of a sudden allowed publicly funded research to be patented, which before couldn't. Or today we can patent genes, which before we couldn't. So it's actually really hard with the patent data to really control for the fact that you're simply patenting things that before you couldn't patent.
Staying with the key concepts around the state's role in promoting innovation and industrial development, I asked Mariana to explain the role of concepts such as market failures, public goods and externalities. She also went on to explain why such notions are insufficient to describe the state's role.
So the market failure framework, what it suggests is that, markets, when they're working well, when you have perfectly competitive markets, everything's fine, but then there's these problems. You can get market failures, and that justifies government intervention. For example, if you have a public good, which has, for example, basic research, which has very high spillovers, think of nuclear fusion, that's the reason I speak like, I sound like American, but I'm 100% Italian, I promise you, born in Italy, Italian parents. But when I was 5, we moved to Princeton, New Jersey, because my father does nuclear fusion, and in the US, the Department of Energy funds 100% of nuclear fusion. Why? Because no private firm would want to invest in nuclear fusion, not just because the cost is so high, but if and when it's ever invented, which is always 30 years away, if you ask these fusion guys, it's going to be so hard just to appropriate that knowledge because it's going to be, big discovery. You're not going to be able to appropriate the knowledge around that just to one company. So anytime you have these really high kind of, spillover effects like you do with basic R&D, not applied R&D, the idea is that you're going to get too little private investment in that area, and so the government has to step in. Or if you have different situations where you have positive and negative externalities would be like pollution, which I'm sure in this green community you guys think about a lot, which the private firms are not internalizing the cost to that unless they are taxed for the pollution. Then you need, again, that government intervention through tax. What I have been interested in is that if you actually look at the few places in the world, and I'll just say this and we can go into the details later, which have actually achieved what governments all around the world today are trying to achieve, which is not any kind of growth, not the kind of Osborne growth, but the smart innovation-led growth. These are companies where the public intervention went way beyond any sort of market failure justification. So for example, the whole innovation chain, if you think of it, there's basic research, applied research, early stage seed financing of companies, that kind of commercialization area. What you had in places like Silicon Valley, but you have today in China, very much. You have in Germany, you have in Brazil. You don't have in all the BRICS. That's why I hate these terms like BRICS, as if Russia and Brazil couldn't be farther apart in terms, for example, of their approach to these questions. You've actually had a very, very active public sector across that entire innovation chain. And sometimes, however, that is actually justified also through market failure. So for example, early stage seed financing of companies could be actually justified simply through asymmetric information, that somehow you have these really innovative companies, but banks that are too risk averse won't lend to them because they're just not sure, are they really innovative, are they not? You have all sorts of problems of degree to which banks can actually really know what's happening in a firm that's going to go into this really uncertain area. But again, what's interesting if you look at these places, again, like Silicon Valley, China, Germany, Denmark, Finland, Brazil, is that these kind of what I call mission-oriented investments versus just fixing little market failures, bandages here and there, were characterized, A, by activity across the entire innovation chain, B, by huge amounts of money, massive, right? So in the US, National Institutes of Health, $32 billion a year. This is not just, a little support here and there, but C, driven by missions. Missions meaning, putting a man on the moon in the past, or tackling climate change today, or really thinking about health as a mission in terms of providing, this is ironic because the US doesn't have a healthcare system, but at least it's innovation around healthcare. If you look at the NIH website, National Institutes of Health website, it's very much written in terms of our mission is to produce higher quality health products for our population so we can tackle the big diseases, whether it's cancer or obesity or whatever. And so these mission-driven investments, it's very hard to justify them at the scale and the breadth that they've been, and the kind of dream, the vision for big changes, if you're just thinking about putting bandages here and there around public goods or positive negative externalities.
I then asked Mariana to explain why these issues are so important to the development of a green economy. In response, she emphasised how the state had a vital role to not only correct market failures, but also to create and shape markets if a dynamic green sector was to develop. Here's what she had to say.
Pollution is a market failure. The fact that firms don't, do that, don't, internalize those costs. The carbon price would be a way to, think about market failures. But then the big question is, why is it that we're not even close to really having this, let's just call it green revolution, even though I have problems with that word. But why don't we have this, huge kind of dynamic ecosystem of innovation around green technology in all these different countries? I think the reason is exactly because we've just thought about it in terms of market failures. You're really limiting how you're talking about things.
Yeah.
If, in the Stern report and then the later work, you just keep referring to market failures as opposed to something on top of that. So, fixing market failures and what? Shaping and creating markets. You need actually to create that market. It doesn't exist. That's very different from just fixing existing markets. Yeah, so coming back to Polanyi, right, so maybe I should just do my quick Polanyi pitch because he really was radical. Because it's related to this. So Polanyi's whole point was he looked at markets for the last kind of 3,000 years, and he's like, oh yeah, they kind of do look natural. It is this kind of universal, it is human nature, but not the capitalist market. So he said, local markets where you buy fruit and, oranges or whatever on the corner, that's existed since 3,000 years. International markets like trade, countries and different far apart areas trading, that's also existed forever. But the national market, meaning where you have almost a sense of, an average price for a kilo of oranges in a country, that was forced by the state, that didn't exist, and that's about 250 years old. And so that is the capitalist market, and the capitalist market is the only market, local, national versus international. So the national capitalist market was imposed by the state. It would not have existed. Now, in innovation, this is even more true, which is that if you look at actually what created the internet before the internet economy, nanotechnology as a sector, biotechnology as a sector, and hence a market. And the emerging green economy, it was forced, it was kicked, it was not nudged, it was pushed through this massive amount of state investments, which created the market, created nanotechnology. The word nanotechnology didn't exist. It wasn't as if business was like, oh, we would love to do nanotech, but you know what? We would love this R&D tax credit, or do this, that, the other. It just, the vision, the mission, that area came out of government. Now, that doesn't mean this is always the case, but for the really important technologies, coming back to what do you mean by innovation, if you look at the general purpose technologies, meaning these really important technological changes, whether it's mass production, internet, aerospace, they came from, again, the vision, the mission. These broad investments came mainly from government, and later the private sector entered and played an extremely important role. But that's different from thinking it was kind of there, and then the government just provided little help here and there through these patches. It just misses the whole history.
In response to a question from the audience, Mariana discussed the role of SMEs and other actors such as venture capitalists in innovation.
So I have nothing against SMEs, I have nothing pro big companies. It's more, what I've been trying to do is rebalance the narrative. So my point is simply, innovation, actually better understanding how it's occurred in different places is really important. So history, economic history is important, which unfortunately is no longer fashionable in economics departments. Instead, we tend to have these narratives and these mythologies around the role of some actors, like the garage tinkerers or the geniuses like Steve Jobs, or venture capital as a sector providing this early stage seed finance for innovation, and hyping down or dismissing other actors like the different types of public investments. By the way, when I say the word state, I don't mean Big Brother, top down. I mean kind of this decentralized network state. So SMEs. The problem is that part of this kind of mythological narrative around, for example, what led to Silicon Valley, or today the whole tech city kind of narrative, is, if you look at most SMEs, they are unproductive, not very innovative, don't create many net jobs. So net job creation is almost zero. So something like only 4% of new companies that come out in sort of a 5-year period, only 4% of those create 50% of the job creation of that entire, so it's a very small group of SMEs that actually even produce the jobs within even just the SME category. Then if you look at, the entire size population, it's even less. But the point is, the ones that do are extremely important. These, call them gazelles or high growth innovative companies, which, both create jobs, they increase productivity, they increase innovation. Once this funding gets to them, it's actually too little because it's been sprayed across that entire group. So in the UK, we spend, I think it's $8 billion a year, which is not little. They're not underfinanced. They get more than the entire police force, close to what the whole university sector gets. So they're not underfinanced in any way. The problem is that once it gets to these really innovative companies that would have the potential to, again, create jobs, productivity, innovation, it isn't enough. So that there is a problem for those, but the way to talk about it is not that there's a supply of finance problem, which makes it sound like you've got these great companies that want to be doing great things and they just don't have that finance. Like, we need great finance, banks are ignoring us. That's not the case. You have a demand for finance problem, meaning you don't have enough of these high growth, innovative companies in this country, similar to some other countries in Europe, but we have below average R&D spending at the business level. So BIRD, that's what it's called, business R&D over sales, is below OECD average in the UK. So if that's the case, then the question is, how do you actually get UK businesses to spend more on R&D? And this notion that you just have to incentivize them through things like R&D tax credits misses the point, but also this kind of mythology that what we need is more finance to our SME population also misses the point. You need better ways to target your financing towards these companies, which you might not know ex ante. So then the question is, how do you do it in a way that you allow possibilities for these companies to emerge? But the part and parcel of dismissing the state has been to hype up these other agents, which, by the way, have very strong lobbying power. So I always, I usually bash not so much the SMEs, but venture capital as a sector has been really dysfunctional. In the US, the National Venture Capital Association, which formed, I think it was in 1974, they became very active lobbying, and in 1976, their big mission was to get capital gains tax reduced, and they succeeded precisely through this narrative. We're the venture capital community. We provide, the early stage seed finance, which just isn't true. Again, they come in kind of 15 to 20 years after. If you want the new economy, you have to, make us kind of richer and make it easier for us to fund. And they managed to get the capital gains tax reduced by 50%. It went from 40% in 1976 to 20% in 1981. And all that did was increase inequality. The best person who talks about this is Warren Buffett. There's a wonderful quote that he wrote in the New York Times where he's like, I never, capital gains just has never affected any of my real investments. I look for the technological and market opportunities, and that's where I go. And that's even more so with the kind of innovative companies. We know that they're not very sensitive to tax. And so this mythology of both the SMEs and the VC funding has actually also had a huge regressive, result in terms of taxation. And I have other examples, but I have nothing against SMEs. It's more the narrative, which is just mythologizing this innovation, entrepreneurial spirit stuff, which just misses the point.
Mariana stressed that she was not diminishing the role of the private sector in innovation, but was simply trying to rebalance the narrative that had typically ignored the state's role.
First of all, I always have to remember to say this because I forget to. We know the private sector is important. We're told that every day. So this is not about the private sector not being important. This is just saying when we talk about public-private partnerships, for example, which we know are important, we don't understand the public part. So we know, there's books also that tell us how important it is to continue to be innovative even when you become big. General Electric, General Motors, how do you retain the kind of innovative spirit even when you get big and bureaucratic? There's all sorts of studies about that. The point is, by dismissing the public part as equally innovative and that you need these public-private partnerships, we have, for example, haven't said this yet, but it's very important, also not thought enough about how you actually create innovative public sector organizations. You don't just fund innovation, you have to yourself be quite innovative. For example, the BBC is a very innovative public broadcasting organization because it has actually also invested in-house in innovation. Anyway, so it's not about saying everything was public sector funded. Of course, there's many examples that were either all public, all private, but most are public-private. My point is not to say the state did everything. It's to say we are missing a huge part of the story by pretending that all the state does is kind of regulate the process or create the conditions for innovation, facilitate, de-risk, as opposed to also be one of the lead investors, which then the private sector comes in, and of course they're important. Or in some cases, the private guys that started it. So that's not, you don't need me to come here to tell you that there's all sorts of examples where the private sector did things. The problem is that in this big, fat biography of Steve Jobs, not one damn word, in a huge book, right? How many pages was it? 700. Not one word, let alone a page, were dedicated to admitting that actually Apple has used existing technology in a really smart way. It was great he took that calligraphy class. It was great that these guys still today are really innovative in terms of design, simplicity. That's hugely important. That's an intangible capital, by the way. That's a very important measure of innovation. Design is very important. But if they hadn't had existing technology, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, all these things in the iPhone that were government funded, you could be as smart as you want, or his whole talk to the Stanford graduating class, be hungry, be foolish, because that's what's going to keep you innovative. Well, in Greece, you'll just stay hungry and foolish if you're hungry and foolish, because you don't have a state that is funding these kind of things. So it's just to rebalance the discourse. It's not to say the state does everything.
In response to another question from the audience, Mariana set out her views on the role of monopolies and the behaviour of large corporations in promoting innovation.
In terms of monopolies, well, first of all, Google is a major exception. Okay, and in fact, at this conference that I've organized for next week, one of the speakers is the vice president of energy in Google. Google today is one of the only big companies, as you say, basically a monopoly, that reinvests its profits back into, mega profits, back into innovation. Wouldn't it be great if all these companies with all that cash, A, weren't hoarding, which is what most of them are doing. We're at record levels of hoarding today, $2 trillion in the US, more than $1 trillion in the UK, or close to $1 trillion in the UK, and not just buying back their own shares. When you ask them why you're buying back your own shares, and these are mainly the energy companies and pharmaceuticals, because they're the biggest buybackers, they say there's no opportunities. And then you look at, there's no opportunities in renewables, there's no opportunities in life sciences. Of course there are. This is a problem of financialization of these very large corporations, which people like John Kay and Andy Howley talk about. Apple, under Steve Jobs, did no share buybacks. He really did that. Even though I sort of criticized that whole Steve Jobs narrative, he really was innovative. Also, in that sense, he made sure his company, it was his in the last years, mainly, was reinvesting profits back into what they knew was their bottom line in terms of future growth and profits, which was the products. Under Tim Cook, the first thing he did was a $60 billion share buyback scheme. So I've just written an article with Bill Izanik on Apple's business model and what this is. Is this a problem for Apple's future innovation? The fact that this new sort of change in ways of thinking about how to deal with this excess cash. Anyway, by the way, another really important example is AT&T. Because AT&T was a big monopoly, right, in the U.S. It later got broke up into on the Bells, whatever. But Bell Labs, right, which was one of the very important labs in the private sector in AT&T, co-funded a lot of the stuff with the state. But the point is that was an outcome, Bell Labs, of a negotiation between AT&T and government. It wasn't that AT&T just woke up one day and said, oh, wouldn't it be great to do this Bell Labs thing and be really innovative. Government actually, I don't want to say negotiated because it sounds like it happened in one day, but forced AT&T over time, if it wanted to be left alone and remain the monopoly that it was, to reinvest its profits back into production. So lots of these cases where you've had also very active, not always, but anyway, private sector companies reinvesting profits back in and even setting up these big R&D labs, which today we don't have, by the way. There's a great MIT report that says, where are the Xerox PARCs and Bell Labs today? They're not in Cisco, they're not in Pfizer. A recent example is Fiat, Fiat Motors in Italy was quite inertial, no investment in hybrid engines, or it goes to America, buys Chrysler recently, and Obama, who's quite confident and at least is into kind of industrial policy, a very interesting thing he did with Fiat was, okay, well, part of the negotiation, the deal, is you invest in hybrid technology, and they are. So it's all these things are about also relationships and tension is good, and having two strong partners is a good thing. What you often have, unfortunately, is, and I would argue in the UK, the private side having the upper hand. So GlaxoSmithKline got this government to introduce this patent box, which is the stupidest policy ever. I don't know any innovation economist who supports it, which is just going to really hurt UK tax revenue without having any effect on innovation.
Mariana also emphasised the importance of the state's role being driven by some clear purpose or mission, such as eliminating CO2 emissions, and the need to accept risks and the inevitability of some failures along the way. Here's what she had to say.
So the point of a mission, is also this notion that, because I agree with your point that on the one hand, it can't be so general, like climate change, it almost doesn't mean anything, right? But it also can't be so specific, like offshore wind, right? So, but it also needs to be specific enough that you kind of know when you've gotten there. If it's just so general, again, it just becomes this trendy way to talk about something which is not clear what it is, and you're not sure if you're, sort of getting there. There could be different types of technologies, right, that would actually allow you to sort of get there. And so one issue is this whole portfolio approach, right, that you want a mission that's specific, that's not too broad, but is also broad enough that lots of things are going to be able to be under that sort of heading. Because, shale is 100% government funded, by the way. And the US government was also, since the crisis under Obama, actually doing lots of stimulus around green. And there was all sorts of, things that they were doing through, for example, ARPA-E and different types of renewable technology. And the question is, if you have a portfolio like that within a pretty concrete mission, it also requires you to really kind of think about risks in a different way. So you will still be doing some things that are not so high risk, some things that are very risky, but through this portfolio approach, it means you will fail most of the time. You will fail. You'll get plenty of these cylinders, but you'll also every now and then get something like the Tesla investment. Both Tesla and Solyndra were government funded in terms of, the Tesla S car, 500 million, guaranteed loan. Solyndra, same amount. Solyndra goes bust, Tesla doesn't. But so to me, what's interesting in terms of the question you just said, which is A, it can't be too broad, it has to be specific enough, but specific with lots of different choices within it. It's kind of plurality. But one of the questions that someone like Andy Sterling asks at Sprue, who runs the STEP Center with IDS, is, well, how do we make the decisions also in terms of directionality within this kind of plurality? And one thing is we've stopped collecting information. One of his colleagues told me this with biotech. We don't even know why things in biotech are going in one way instead of another. We actually don't have that data. We used to collect it. For whatever reason, we don't anymore. And also just this whole kind of civil society element, and this is, I think, where the Green Alliance comes in, which you're trying to foster debate. This is the irony that by not admitting that the state is really important, it doesn't mean the state is good. Again, I personally don't think shale gas was, well, anyway, the point is someone might think it's good, someone might not, but where was the debate? So whereas with the debt, we always say, our grandchildren, the debt is terrible, we should keep the debt low and, low deficits, whatever, because, debt to GDP, because our grandchildren are going to pay the consequences, right? So the idea is debt, that's government, that's a lot of stuff, and our grandchildren are going to pay the consequences. With innovation, we don't talk about it that way because we don't admit that the government has this transformational market-creating, market-shaping role that makes things happen that would not have happened anyway. So shale was made through these US government investments. Where was the debate on whether it's good for our grandchildren?
I then asked Mariana about the title of her book, The Entrepreneurial State. I wondered whether, even if one could accept that the state had a role to play in innovation, it might be much harder to see it as an entrepreneur. So I asked her to explain what she meant by this, and she emphasised the need for the state to be willing to engage with the huge uncertainty and risk associated with entrepreneurship.
My definition is definitely not, when I say entrepreneurial state, I don't mean the state doing what Steve Jobs did, which is using existing technology and thinking of a new market for those technologies. That is a traditional way to think of entrepreneurship, which is either setting up a new company, state doesn't do that. In some countries it does state-owned companies, but that's not what I'm interested in. And it's not about, the state creating a new market for an existing technology. Like the stickums, for example, existed, and all of a sudden they were, or the fax machine is a typical example, that it was an existing technology, which then some entrepreneurs thought about the real use, the real way to sort of diffuse those technologies in the market. That's not my interest. For me, entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial state is very simple. What I mean by it, it's the ability and willingness to really engage with the extreme uncertainty in risk, which innovation, basically implies. And so looking at different sectors and actually dividing up the risk landscape, even as simple as literally, if you think of it as a quadrant, you have capital intensity on the vertical axis, technological and market risk on the horizontal. You divide it into four. The upper right-hand quadrant today in renewables is almost all public funding. So it's just about who is actually funding the really high-risk stuff. But by the way, Bloomberg New Energy Finance is the best database on this. It's very interesting. You can break it down, who's funding what. And again, it's not about saying, oh, the state is great. It's about admitting that the state has actually been, often is, the lead risk taker, lead investor, and hence will often fail. And instead of bashing it when it fails, make sure that you set things up the right way. First of all, even the word de-risking, what the hell does that mean? The state didn't de-risk the internet. It, funded it, and it took on that risk. And, taking on risk, sharing risks, already immediately allows you to talk about potentially sharing rewards. But de-risking, it just sounds so lame. You're just facilitating the profit-making machine in the private sector. Why should you take anything back? By the way, can I just say the Tesla example is a really important example, because there was an agreement in there that said that government could actually buy, because it gave the early stage money to the Tesla S, which today is quite successful. By the time the loan was paid back 3 years later, 2013, the price per share was 96. Government hadn't made a move. So even when it's written down that you have a right to make a bit of a profit, so to do it again, government is not confident to do it, because it doesn't want to be seen as too engaged, too captured, to making profits. And it's like, why? Oh, because we're just supposed to be facilitating. Well, it's like, no, you took on this massive risk. So this is what's really interesting. Even when it's written, and usually it's not written, they don't do it because they're scared. This comes back to this asymmetry of power.
Many of the examples that Mariana uses seem to relate to spin-offs from government-led military and security R&D. I wondered whether this could really be generalised to other areas of innovation. Here's what she had to say.
Yeah, so usually when I put up the iPhone example, then you look at all the agencies that I talk about. There's the CIA. The CIA in the U.S. has the biggest public venture capital fund called InQtel. It's Department of Defense, the Navistar program, and anyway, it sounds like it's all the military-industrial complex, and fine, it sort of was with the iPhone kind of technology. But actually, what's interesting about the U.S. is that model, the DARPA model, right? DARPA, which funded the internet, was then applied to energy and to health. So the National Institutes of Health are the second biggest spenders in the U.S., health, not military, on innovation after the Department of Defense. As I said, $32 billion a year, just for biotech and pharma. And so to me, that's not the point. It's not about it's the military-industrial complex. It's more about what is it you're actually funding, and is that right? And so what, for example, again, within health, on the one hand, you have the situation where the government actually funded all the radical stuff. This is Marcia Angel's work, which is really important. She shows that 75% of the revolutionary medicines, so the new molecular entities with priority rating, were funded by NIH, with private pharma doing more than Me Too drugs. But my question is more like, well, why drugs? Why, if you are the public sector, or even third sector, this would be even more important in some ways for the third sector, like Wellcome, Trust, and Crick. When you enter a space, but this should definitely be also true in energy, you should transform it, you should change it. You shouldn't be doing what the private sector is doing, and it's all about drugs in pharma. John Abrams writes about this in terms of pharmaceuticalization of the industry. It's all about medicine. What you should be doing is funding exactly those areas that are being starved of research, like lifestyle. A bunch of hippies like us think it's good to jog, drink green tea, do other things, but there's no research behind it, or very little compared to how much research is going on in these other areas. So diagnostics, surgical treatments, lifestyle have much less research than medicine. So it's not about, oh, is it military, is it not? It's whatever it is, health, energy, and the more defense-related areas. if you are public sector, you should be pushing the frontier, doing the not just long-termist stuff, but really the kind of difficult areas which the private sector doesn't do. So the dysfunction, again, comes in where unless you have that really clearly laid out, and the market failure framework does not lay it out because it assumes an existing market and looks at government putting little patches in existing areas, then you might actually get a situation where you do end up crowding out because you're working with an existing space, which, why doesn't private sector fund that? Maybe because you're doing it.
Critics often see the notion of an expanded government role in innovation as a statist solution. I wondered whether the failings of capitalism could be better addressed through corporate reform rather than enhancing the state's role.
What I've been telling ministers, including the other day, is stop talking about ecosystems and start telling us what kind of ecosystems, and what you actually want is more symbiotic, mutualistic ecosystems and less parasitic predator-prey ones. And so it's not about the state just doing more. And status actually means something else, but it's not just about asking for more industrial policy, more innovation policy. It's actually asking also the private sector to co-invest with you, not in this romantic way of going back to the Xerox PARC Bell Labs kind of era, which obviously lots of things have changed, but definitely to co-invest together in these opportunities. So if you are a company like Cisco and like Pfizer that spend more on share buybacks than R&D, unlike, say, Ericsson, in terms of Cisco's competitors, no share buybacks, or within pharmaceuticals some do much less, then you shouldn't be able to, for example, be equally as eligible of getting these massive subsidies and tax credits, because you're not reinvesting your profits into those areas which we know produce massive, in this case I'll use the word public goods. So it is about corporate governance. So there's no point in trying to imitate Germany's, Fraunhofer Institutes through catapult centers here if you don't also get more stakeholder versus shareholder type corporate governance in these companies, which we know is, definitely helps the inequality problem. And so actually my main concern today is not innovation but inequality, because the innovation discourse has been one of the lead, I think, forces behind inequality. If you look at all the Piketty curve, from 76 onwards, this is when lots of this crazy stuff starts happening. Again, it's exactly when the capital gains tax goes down. 50% is a huge reduction. And he talks about capital gains, but doesn't talk about why it fell. And it fell through an innovation narrative. It was the VC guys. Be careful how we talk about VC and the kind of benefits we're giving to a particular agent in this innovation ecosystem, because we've hyped up the role of that agent. So it is about admitting that the kind of innovation policy should be mission-oriented, not market failure, but that doesn't mean we just ask the state to do everything and allow these companies that are increasingly financialized. VC is increasingly short-termist. It was the Labour Party that in this country made private equity the investments to get these capital gains tax reductions went down from 10 years to 2 years. So it made VC even more short-termist because of the hype around VC. So none of these actors exist in isolation. They are results of how we interact with them, just like my example with Fiat. Fiat invested in hybrid because the discussion, the tension, the narrative, the deal was there. So it's not just about the New Deal, which is government spending more. It's also about the deal between government and business. And that's about corporate governance and all sorts of other things.
In response to a question from the audience, Mariana explained how she saw the importance of engaging finance ministries, such as the UK Treasury, in developing an innovation strategy. This needs to be part of a broader vision, which recognises the government's role in determining not only the pace of innovation, but also, crucially, its direction.
I'm getting asked to go visit lots of countries, advising governments, and ministers of finance, which is when it gets exciting, because that's the real schism. When you have the Vince-Gable types doing as many good things as they want, but until you get the Osbornes in the Treasury, then it becomes useless. Or think of it at the EC level. You have DG, RTD, DG, innovation, whatever it's called, research, talking about 80 billion on research, innovation, lots of it green directed, and then you get ECFIN, which is the DG of the finance ministers, basically forcing Spain, for example, to cut its publicly funded R&D by 40% in order to meet this fiscal compact. So until you get the Treasury involved in all this, it is actually quite useless. But what I found encouraging, so this is a bit less negative than what you were portraying, is the 14 different countries that I've visited recently. I've been talking to the treasuries, in some cases when they have them, the central banks, alongside the innovation ministers. And on a personal level, that's where I find the conversation changes completely. And it's what's missing here. It's what you, and by the way, some of the mission stuff occurs best when you have also something even on top of the mission, which is a vision. So Brazil, for example, has a real vision for doing innovation and poverty alleviation at the same time. That really requires also a whole narrative that's very different from just saying, oh, innovation, smart this, smart that. But having said that, I wouldn't say, in fact, this is sort of also answering someone else's question before about the U.S. somehow being easier because they like to compete. Actually, the U.S. is clueless about this. The American people have no clue that the U.S. government has been doing all this stuff. So just think of the Obamacare fight. You're meddling in our health care. He should have had his non-Goldman Sachs advisors in the background saying, oh, listen, tell them that we created the healthcare system. Tell them that we created 75% of the drugs they need that they go buy in the pharmacies. That would have changed the conversation a bit. It doesn't mean he would have won, but the point is the American people have no clue what their government is doing. So we don't have a marketing department within governments, let alone, it's not about the media being terrible. It's about governments themselves not being confident enough to even tell people what the hell they've done in the few places that have even done it. Then you have the problem of places that aren't, which then learn the wrong lessons from places like the U.S. Anyway, say about the whole directionality issue, which you sort of raised as well, is the best work out there really is Andy Sterling. He's God on directionality, so ask him or read his stuff on this because, the point is innovation doesn't just have a rate, it has a direction. Who determines the direction? So it's not enough to say, oh, the state's really important and the private sector is inertial in doing, the easy stuff and the state's doing the hard stuff. Yes, that's true. But what is it that the state is actually doing? It's not just that the private big oil guys are doing this extractive stuff. Actually, it's often even the state that's doing the extractive stuff. I mean, again, shale, the state. So it's not as easy as, public long-term good, private short-term bad. It's about directionality in general. What to do about it, how to think about it, what mechanisms we have to even debate it. And this comes back to the whole market failure thing that by just pretending that all we're doing is fixing failures and facilitating things for that private sector, that big question that you're asking, that's not the framework through which to ask it.
Mariana rounded off the evening by discussing industrial policy and the need to improve the recognition of the importance of public servants who work in this area. She felt that if we continually denigrate the government's role, we'll make it harder to attract the right people into the public sector.
Industrial policy, they're definitely doing more than before and it's better than before. However, there's different issues with it. One, how it's been positioned. So I usually put up my nice Andy Haldane graph where he shows financialization. So the percentage of value added made up of just financial intermediation versus real value added, which is basically everything but finance and agriculture. If you look at the graph, you have, financial intermediation as value added and real like that. So then that's the kind of graph that in countries like both the US and the UK, where you have had this extreme financialization, which means finance lending to finance, not to the real economy. The idea is we need to rebalance, that's the word, right? We need to rebalance from the takers to the makers, from finance to industry, from the hedge funds to aerospace and what else do they like? Automobiles and life sciences and creative sector and whatever the hell they say. And it's like, really? Let's start looking at the sectors that you're talking about. They are just as financialized as the banks. So that's the first point, that one of the reasons that industrial policy in this country is currently a bit weak is it hasn't, this comes back to your point, been lined up with serious sort of financial reform and corporate governance issues. Because actually the real economy in the UK and the US is super financialized, and so it's not just about giving it some, graphene investments or whatever the hell it is. It's about definancializing companies to get them again to spend more. That they've made no mark on that, zero. So there's been zero activity on that. Two, the things they have been doing, whether it's the catapults, apprenticeships, there is a question of scale, or the SBRI scheme, or even TSB. Compared to the kind of scale you even have in places like Denmark, without having to look at the US. I mean, the catapults are a fraction of the Fraunhofer Institutes. SBRI is a fraction of SBIR, but money's not enough. It's not just about throwing money at these things. And is it about demand creation? So does TSB, for example, have the ability to create markets like DARPA does through procurement? No. So we don't have that demand creation power, and that really limits industrial policy. But for sure, if you have a narrative where you're just fixing market failures, it's not going to be very sexy to go work in government. I mean, you're going to make a shitload more money working Goldman Sachs or Google. if you start having this kind of mission-oriented thing, you get the Nobel Prize winners, which, you know, and you don't have to win a Nobel Prize, but the point is that kind of quality. The Department of Energy, which you're all interested in, obviously, being run by a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Steve Chu, in the US up until 6 months ago, it makes a difference. Then the kind of people he brings in, like Arun Majumdar, who's speaking at this conference, who set up ARPA-E, or he was the first founder, the director, you know, that creates a whole vibe and energy and dynamism that you don't get when it's just, you know, kind of bureaucrats who might not have much expertise in that area. Having said that, I'm always the one who says, you know, stop calling the state people just bureaucrats, but it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you call the state just a bunch of inert bureaucrats, well, that's what you're going to get. Because who's going to want to go work in the state? And so that is a huge challenge for places like the UK, that by just talking about market failures, and worse, even Cameron saying civil servants are the enemies of enterprise, well, who the hell's going to want to go work in the state?